So you've trekked the mountains of Nepal, canoed the mighty Mackenzie, and braved the searing heat of the Australian outback. Now get ready for the real test, the Tour d'Afrique first ever Cairo to Cape Town bicycle race. Could we pass up this challenge? No way, so we signed up. The route started in Cairo in Egypt and went through 11 countries and ended up in Cape Town, South Africa. Soon we were at Heathrow Airport with our bikes ready for the off. We flew to Athens first and then on down to Cairo. In Cairo, we went to the hotel we had booked and unpacked our bicycles. A few days later, we all gathered in front of the hotel and we were ready for the off. We were a mixed group, 35 racers and various members of the support team. The plan was for the race to start from in front of the Sphinx at the pyramids at Giza in Cairo. And we all gathered there ready for the off. We had our photograph taken in front of this arch. Soon we were cycling out of Cairo on the way to the Red Sea. Now we were truly on our way to Cape Town. Then each day we had to get into routine of putting up our tents. Then each morning it was exciting to get back on the road. It was interesting how we all spread out and sometimes we were up to 20 kilometers apart. In each country the plan was for a local team to join us and race with us. This is the Egyptian team. After some way we left the Red Sea and headed back up into the mountains towards the Nile. It was quite a climb because at this point the Nile is still quite a way above sea level. In Egypt we could not go far away from our camp at night because of the fear of landmines. We had a military escort come along to protect us. Each evening there were chores to be done and one American guy was taking great care of his bike by covering up his gears. Back on the road the Egyptian team led the way and they thought they were stronger than us, but we soon showed that they were just about the same as we were. Soon we were coming into Luxor, and we were having our first rest day after 8 days on the road. While we were in Luxor, we had an opportunity to view the buildings and relics from the ancient Egyptian times. Egyptian history is fascinating, and one could spend a lot of time amongst the buildings as we had done in the past. It's possible to walk in amongst the temples and admire the workmanship of old. In Napoleon's time, the French had been here, trapped by the British, and they had put graffiti on some of the walls of the temples. The workmanship is amazing to see, and the rows and rows of columns with the hieroglyphics standing up the columns telling the stories of the history. On the opposite side of the Nile is the Valley of the Kings, where later pharaohs were buried. An interesting temple is this one to Queen Hatshepsut, who was one female pharaoh. In Luxor we found a nice hotel and were able to get a nice meal. Further along we came to the 3,400 years old Colossus of Menen. You can get an impression of the scale of the building by the size of the people in front of them. There was no scarcity of guns in Egypt. Some of the camping areas chosen by the Egyptians were very small. It was always nice to rest after a hard day's ride. Notices for each day were written on the door of the truck. Now we were traveling through very rural Egypt. We were traveling on the east side of the Nile, and you can see how there's a green strip on each side of the river, which is formed by the floods that come down from Ethiopia each year. The boats that ply the Nile are called feluccas. Continuing on in groups or singly with police outriders. Eventually we came to the Aswan Dam and crossed over to the west side of the river. This road down to the Sudanese border had only recently been opened to the public. Here's Moira making good time as she cycles along through the desert. Each night in Egypt we had to camp quite close together because of security. Eventually we came to Abu Simbel with its massive temple built to Ramesses II. This temple was originally built into the bank of the river, but when they were filling the Aswan Dam, they had to take the temple apart and raise it up to higher ground and reconstruct it above the water level. The temple had to be reconstructed exactly as it was before it was taken apart to move onto the higher ground. In the temple there's a long tunnel at the end of which there are statues of Ramesses II. On Ramesses' birthday, the rising sun shines down this tunnel and strikes the statues at the end. In ancient times, the statues were encased in precious stones, but now, of course, they have all been plundered. Along the walls of the tunnel are carvings showing life as it was in the time of Ramesses II. There's no road access from Egypt into Sudan, so we had a barge that took us on a 10-hour trip across Lake Nasser to get to Sudan. This gave us a marvelous opportunity to see the temple on its raised ground from the east. After our 10-hour trip down Lake Nasser, we came to Wadi Halfa in Sudan and were met by a welcoming party. The flag of Sudan welcomed us. We were welcomed by happy groups of children. Some of the older people wanted to try out our bicycles. Now we were out in the desert and there were no roads and the going got tough. We were given notices in Arabic to carry in case we got lost. Moira is suitably dressed to protect her from the sun. The call to prayer from the mosque. We are now well down into Africa. We camped in some spectacular spots and we could now spread out more because we were in Sudan. We got some lovely grapefruits in a village and enjoyed them by our tent. The air was very clear and we had some beautiful sunsets. And then after sunset, the moon rose and we had a full moon. We could see the constellation of stars that we're so familiar with. We traveled close to the river, but sometimes we would go away from the river into spectacular countryside. At times the sand became very heavy and it was so difficult that it was easier to walk than to cycle. This is Maura's bike parked by the track in the desert, and Maura sitting out on the sand. Sudanese culture is very interesting. Most families live in compounds and they paint the doors to identify their family. In Van village, we were invited into a party, and this is unusual because here we have women and men in the same area, which is not normal. They made us very welcome and served us very sweet tea and bread. Meanwhile, outside, some of the older folks wanted to try out our bicycles. When we came out, we decided to ride on a truck that some fellows had flagged down because we had 28 kilometers to go to camp. Each of us got a 12-hour penalty, and because I didn't ride the whole way from Cairo to Cape Town, I wasn't able to get my name on the Guinness Book of Records list. Characters we passed along the way. Camels are very precious in the desert, and there are herds of them being driven in different directions by their owners across the desert. They are moved from place to place in herds. Here, Maura is racing a herd of camels across the desert. Another herd of camels being driven through a town. Not all camels make it, and these mounds ahead are camels that didn't survive the drive. They end up dead and gradually rot away in the desert. If you believe in reincarnation, you shouldn't come back as a donkey, because donkeys have to work very hard in this world. Since leaving Cairo, we had traveled down along the Nile and into Luxor and then on down to the border with Sudan. Then we continued on the east side of the Nile until we came to this loop. We didn't want to go round the loop, so instead had to cross the Nile to the west bank. The organizers had booked a barge for us to cross the river, and while we waited, the locals wanted to try out our bicycles. Eventually the barge arrived and we all got on with difficulty and set off to cross the river. As we crossed, we met locals making their way along the river. It was always nice to rest after a long day in the sun. Here the Swiss lady had won the stage for the day. Fun with the boys. Our next stop was in a place called Dongola, where we were having a rest day. We were warmly welcomed and feted by the locals. In the afternoon, the town gathered and put on a fair for us. They had made a mistake on this banner and put on motorcycles. They put on camel races, and the camels got very excited and everybody had a lot of fun. Camels are quite temperamental beasts to handle and control. And the children put on a slow bike race to entertain us. Then the local ladies put on a concert for us, singing in their local language. It was beautiful singing, and the ladies put on a great show for us. We're a bit concerned by the number of people who had climbed up on the water tank to get a better view. After the rest day, it was time to get back on the road. The little children loved our presence. It was like the circus came to town when we arrived. In some towns we'd be entertained with lunch and then sweet speeches, but the speeches were in the local language, so we couldn't understand them. Meanwhile, the security detail would be waiting to escort us out of town. And then we'd be ready to get on our way again. Muslims are very welcoming, and at every village there was always water for ablutions and for drinking. You would never expect to pass without being offered these facilities. Tired cyclists after a long day's ride, travelling on down through Sudan and towards Khartoum. As we approached Khartoum, we were met by another welcoming committee. This fellow in a costume in the colours of the national flag had a drum and he controlled everything. We were met by local dignitaries, but the men could not shake Mora's hand. More singing and dancing, and Mora looking very tired. An impressive, beautiful mosque in the desert. We went to a nightclub where there was more singing and dancing, but no liquor. Carrying on the road towards Ethiopia. Mora waves to the support truck as it passes. Interesting people all along the way. A brick-making factory. Novel places to camp for the night. And then we came to paved road. Unfortunately, the drivers were not that careful on the road, and there were some terrible accidents with lots of fatalities. Discussions at the end of the day. Moira making her way through the crowds. We always stopped for others when they had a puncture or other problems. And then it was on into Ethiopia. The Ethiopian flag. Our route through Ethiopia. We had to go through the Nile Gorge and then up into the highlands of Ethiopia. A rest day, and now beer was available again. Curious onlookers. Our next stop was in Gondar, which was originally the capital of Ethiopia. We had a rest day in Gondar, which gave us an opportunity to view the magnificent buildings of old when Gondar was the capital of Ethiopia. After our rest day in Gondar, we were all ready to get back on the road and on with the race. In the old days, there was a lot of dispute as to the source of the Nile, and it wasn't until much later that they discovered there were in fact two Niles. There was the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and the White Nile starts in Lake Victoria and flows north from there and joins at Khartoum. It joins the Blue Nile, which starts at Lake Tana, high up in the highlands of Ethiopia, and flows down through various gorges and eventually joins the Nile at Khartoum. We were now going on an amazing trip down 5,000 feet into the Nile Gorge, across the Nile, and 5,000 feet up the other side. This is the area where, over the centuries, the erosion caused by the Nile has carried the sediment down and laid it along the sides of the River Nile further downstream. The results of this erosion can be seen all along the way. Magnificent scenery with the Nile River visible right down at the bottom of the gorge. Then we crossed the river at the bottom of the gorge and started the arduous climb back up the other side. A long and tiring climb because of the heat in the gorge. My bicycle after climbing out of the gorge. This is a very poor part of the world and the people are very primitive. They gather to get water at the well, or if a water truck comes by, they all come out with their buckets. The children are very friendly. They shout as we go by, they shout, "I love you," and then they throw stones, which you hear dinging off your spokes. These young ladies carrying the loads on their back and others carrying their books from school. At one place we came across a wedding party. As we approached Addis Ababa, local cyclists came out to greet us and join us along the last part of the road. Here, cyclists carrying the local flag accompany me in the center of the picture as I come to the finish. The day's stage finished 11 kilometers outside Addis Ababa. There we all congregated and were joined by our sponsor, Red Bull. From there, we all cycled fast down into Addis Ababa and were joined by local tribesmen on their little horses. In the city, we were greeted by dignitaries with speeches and dancing girls. The two lead cyclists. Out on the road again, whenever we stopped, we were always surrounded by curious people. Here, a rider from Chicago is looking for his tent. And then it was on through more interesting countryside. Early morning shadows with the sun behind us. More children fascinated by our appearance on the scene. An enthusiastic cyclist with a TDA on his haircut. And then it was on into Kenya. In Kenya, we were joined by a blind rider who had been injured in the US Embassy bombing in Nairobi. He rode on the back of a tandem with a guide rider in front. Warriors in northern Kenya. A lunch break stop on the road. Then it was on into Nairobi. We were invited to a reception at the Canadian Embassy And who could have believed that Moira could come up dressed like this, having got off her bicycle? On the road, Moira liked to give the royal wave as she passed through the villages. People were always fascinated by Moira here putting up her tent. To get permission to camp in a school zone, we agreed to play a football match against the children. The campsites were not always of the best quality. Some primitive facilities at the campsites. When we stopped on the road, the crowds would always gather round and talk to Moira. And so she pedals on. Note she has some extensions on her cycle shorts to keep her knees from getting sunburned. And the countryside continued to vary as we went along, sometimes getting quite difficult, and we had to walk a lot. Then across the equator and on into the southern hemisphere. Of course, everybody gathered for the photograph. Moira having her photograph taken at the equator. A nice campsite by a lake. Not the best way to get through the mud. It was now the wet season in Tanzania and the roads were quite flooded. And Moira just keeps pedaling along. We came up behind this line and Moira said, "What shall I do?" And I said, "Just ring your bell." The colourful people along the road in Tanzania. Moira meeting some friends in Malawi. Lots of singing and dancing. We are now well on our way and closer to Cape Town than to Cairo. We were just coming to 10,000 miles on my computer. Encouraging signs along the way. And then we had the naked mile for anybody who wanted to take part. As we got towards the Cape, we were greeted by beautiful coloured flowers everywhere we looked. The last stage of the journey. Eventually we got to the finish line with Table Mountain in the background. Lots of photographs and celebrations. On our arrival at the finish, some people wanted to put their bikes in the water, but others didn't want to get the salt water on their bikes. Then it was time to pose for the photographs. There we were with Table Mountain in the background. Then we had a celebration dinner and we all got our medals. 2 tough cyclists with a friend, and everybody was warned, don't mess with Moira.